On a bitter winter night, deep in the snowy silence of Montana's wilderness, a man heard something at his door, soft, deliberate, almost human. When he opened it, he didn't find a thief or a storm, but a wounded German shepherd, eyes pleading, body trembling, carrying the weight of some untold journey. What brought this dog here, to the doorstep of a grieving man? And what happened next would melt more than snow. If you believe healing can arrive in fur and silence, stay. Like, subscribe, and follow this story to the very end. The snow had begun falling steadily by late afternoon, blanketing the forests and mountains around Bitterroot Valley, Montana. By dusk, the white world outside Hank Sawyer's cabin was almost indistinguishable from the pale gray sky. The horizon dissolved into a sweeping blur of frost and silence. The temperature had plunged well below freezing. Winds howled like a haunted choir through the pines, and ice crusted along the cabin windows, glowing faintly in the flickering light of the fireplace within. Hank, a man in his late 60s, tall and broad-shouldered with a gray beard that matched the salt in his weathered hair, sat in his worn leather armchair, sipping a mug of black coffee. His hands, large and cracked from decades of forestry work, wrapped around the cup like it was a lifeline. Life in Bitterroot hadn't made him soft. On the contrary, he'd grown harder with time, especially after losing his wife Evelyn to a cabin fire 5 winters ago. Since then, Hank had chosen solitude over the comfort of company, retreating into a self-built wooden cabin nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town of Darby. His days were shaped by ritual, chopping firewood, checking the propane generator, and tending the few hardy plants in his tiny greenhouse. Outside, the wind screamed louder. He leaned forward to stoke the fire, watching orange sparks jump and curl into the chimney like fireflies trying to escape. He was just beginning to relax into the long night when he heard it, a sound so soft, so unlikely, he thought it was a trick of the storm. Scratch, then again, scratch, scratch, whine. Hank froze. The sound came from the front door, more precisely, from just below it. He rose slowly, mug forgotten, and walked across the room to the frost-rimmed window beside the door. Wiping a circle in the glass with the sleeve of his flannel shirt, he peered into the stormy darkness. At first, there was nothing but snow and wind. Then, movement, a huddled, fur-covered form. He squinted. Another low whine pierced the wind, sharper this time, almost human in its desperation. Opening the door just a crack, Hank let the icy wind slice across his face. A blast of snow came in with it, stinging his eyes. And there, barely upright on trembling legs, stood a German shepherd large, but painfully thin, its ribs visible beneath a coat of dirty, matted fur. Snow clung to its back and tail like frost to an old coat left out in the cold too long. One of its ears stood erect, while the other drooped slightly, giving it an oddly lopsided expression of alertness and weariness. Its dark eyes locked onto Hank's eyes that did not show menace, but exhaustion. Pleading. Like something deep inside had cracked, and all that remained was the need to survive. Hank's gut twisted. He hadn't seen a dog up close in years. Evelyn had always wanted one, but life in the wilderness had seemed too cruel a place to raise something so loyal. And yet here it was, loyalty itself, manifesting on his doorstep in the middle of a blizzard. "Where the hell did you come from?" he murmured under his breath. He hesitated. Every practical thought in his head screamed caution. This was still a big animal, a stranger, and it might be sick or dangerous. But those eyes, they reminded him of himself. With a grumble, he opened the door wide. The German shepherd stepped forward slowly, cautiously. It paused at the threshold as if seeking permission, then crossed inside with a barely audible sigh, its limbs stiff with cold. Hank shut the door behind it and bolted it tight against the storm. The warmth of the cabin seemed to hit the dog like a wave. It staggered forward a few more steps, then sank to the wooden floor beside the fireplace, panting heavily. Hank kept his distance at first. He knelt near the table, eyes fixed on the dog. His hand instinctively reaching for the old hiking stick, he kept leaning against the wall. The dog, sensing the tension, merely lowered its head to the floor and lay still, eyes open but unmoving. "Smart," Hank muttered. "You know not to push your luck." He approached slowly, circling wide around the fireplace. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl. It let out a soft chuff of breath, but made no move. As he came nearer, Hank could see more clearly. A gash along the right hind leg, crusted over with blood and dirt. Ice matted parts of its fur, especially around the paws. This dog had been out in the snow for days, maybe longer. It looked to be about 4 years old, full-grown but young enough that its frame still held a kind of nervous energy beneath the fatigue. Its face, noble and sharply defined, had a long scar tracing under one eye, healed but still visible like a whisper from a past fight. Its tail thumped faintly against the wooden floor when Hank knelt beside it. He reached out a hand, the dog's eyes flicked toward him, alert but not alarmed. With one gentle motion, Hank laid his palm flat on the dog's shoulder. Warm, alive, real. "Well," he said softly, "I guess we're both survivors, huh?" He rose and went to the kitchen corner, rummaging through his cupboard until he found a can of corned beef. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He opened it, dumped the contents into a battered metal bowl, and set it gently beside the dog. At first, the shepherd didn't move. Then, with effort, it lifted itself and crept toward the food. It sniffed, then ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, as if remembering what hunger truly felt like. Hank watched from the chair, silent. When the meal was done, the dog returned to the fireplace, curled into itself, and gave a long, shaking breath before its eyes drifted closed. Its chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. It slept. Hank took another sip of coffee, now lukewarm and bitter, and leaned back. The storm outside showed no signs of easing. Snow whirled like ghosts around the windows, but the cabin had never felt warmer. He didn't know where the dog had come from, who might be looking for it, or why it had come to him and not someone else. But tonight, it didn't matter. He leaned forward, whispering as much to himself as to the sleeping animal. "Let's see what tomorrow brings, huh?" The wind had softened, though it still hissed now and then against the cabin walls like a breath through clenched teeth. Inside, the fire cast long, swaying shadows across the wooden floor, and the air smelled of pine smoke and old wool. Hank remained in his armchair long after the German shepherd had drifted into sleep. He didn't know the dog's name, but something about the animal's presence made the room feel less cavernous, less like a shelter for a man hiding from his own silence. It wasn't until the firewood popped sharply, sending a spray of sparks into the hearth, that Hank noticed the dog shifting. A low whimper escaped its throat, not in fear, but pain. The dog stirred, its body curling tighter, and that was when Hank saw it more clearly. In the firelight, just behind the dog's right hind leg, dark fur had been matted with dried blood. The leg trembled slightly, even in rest, and when the dog shifted again, its paw dragged uselessly along the floor. Hank got up slowly, knees stiff, and crouched near the animal. He reached for the flashlight hanging by the door and flicked it on. Its pale beam revealed more than he'd hoped. The wound was raw, crusted, and angry red beneath the fur. A tear in the skin wrapped from just above the hock to nearly the thigh, crusted at the edges, but clearly infected. Hank had seen wounds like this before, on foxes caught in snares, on deer limping through the forest. If left untreated, infection would spread fast in this cold. "Damn," he muttered, then glanced toward the dog's face. The shepherd's eyes were barely open now, drowsy with fatigue, but alert enough to register Hank's movement. It didn't growl, only followed him with a slow, tired blink. He stood and crossed to the kitchen cabinet where he kept a small tin marked first aid, mostly just gauze, some old hydrogen peroxide, tweezers, a bottle of iodine, and a few dusty painkillers from his last visit to the VA clinic. No antibiotics, no vet salves. But it was better than nothing. Spreading a folded blanket on the floor near the fireplace, Hank gently coaxed the dog closer. The shepherd, as though understanding his intent, pushed up onto 3 legs and limped toward the spot, settling with a muffled groan of effort. Hank knelt beside it, opening the tin and laying out what he had. "I'm not a doctor, boy," he said softly, "but I'll try not to make this worse." With a rag soaked in warm water, he began cleaning the wound, wiping away the worst of the dirt and dried blood. The shepherd tensed, ears flicking back, but didn't try to pull away. Hank moved slowly, whispering nonsense under his breath, trying to keep his own hands steady. As he worked, he took in more of the dog's features, its broad chest, now sunken slightly from hunger. The wiry tension still held in its muscles, despite the exhaustion. the intelligence behind those dark eyes. It was a male, likely around 4 or 5 years old, and had the look of something trained, once well trained even, the kind of dog that knew how to wait, how to observe, how to endure, and endure it did. When Hank poured hydrogen peroxide onto the wound, the shepherd jerked, a small yelp escaping its throat, but it didn't lash out. Hank murmured apologies and dabbed gently with gauze. He had no proper bandages, so he improvised with strips of clean cotton and tied them firmly but not tight enough to cut circulation. Once done, he gave the dog a final pat on the shoulder and sat back on his heels. "There," he said, "best I can do." The shepherd licked its nose, eyes half-lidded. Hank took it as a sign of acceptance. Later, after the fire had been stoked and another log added, Hank returned to his chair. The dog slept again, this time curled more tightly, hind legs stretched out on the blanket. The pain had likely dulled, though the infection would remain a threat if not treated soon. From the shelf above the fireplace, Hank took down a photo frame, dusty, the glass chipped. In it was a younger version of himself, beside a woman with dark hair pulled back beneath a woolen cap. Her smile was small but strong. Evelyn. She'd loved dogs, always said they reminded her of people without lies. Hank stared at the photo for a long while before returning it to the shelf. "Wish you could see this, Ev," he murmured. The wind outside fell into a lull. Snow hissed softly against the windows. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch cracked beneath the weight of ice. As the night stretched on, Hank nodded off and woke in shifts, half dreaming, the crackle of the fire mingling with old memories. Evelyn's laugh, the sound of axes and fresh-cut pine, the scent of bread from an oven long cold. At some point past midnight, the shepherd whined again, low and unsure. Hank stirred, rubbed the sleep from his face, and saw the dog struggling to sit up. The bandaged leg trembled beneath it. "Hey," Hank said, gently getting to his feet. "You need something?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but looked toward the door, ears perked. "You want to go out there now?" he asked, incredulous. But then he noticed the look, not urgency, but wariness. The dog's posture was alert, listening. Hank stepped closer to the door, placing a hand against the wood. Nothing but wind. Still, that instinct unsettled him. He waited a moment longer, then turned back. The shepherd had lain back down, but kept its ears turned toward the wall. Hank threw an extra blanket over the dog and returned to his chair. As morning crept over the mountains, pale and colorless, the cabin began to dim as the fire settled into embers. Hank moved stiffly to the fireplace to rekindle it. When the light returned, it cast a soft orange hue across the dog's fur. The shepherd opened its eyes and raised its head slightly. Hank knelt beside it again, reaching for the bandages. They were slightly damp from melted ice, but had held through the night. "Let's check on that leg," he said. He removed the wrappings slowly. The wound didn't look worse, maybe a little less inflamed, though that could just be the warmth. Still, he'd need to find something better than water and gauze if the infection persisted. He stood and walked to the old landline on the kitchen wall. The line had gone dead 2 winters ago, when the pole by the road snapped under heavy ice, and Hank never bothered to have it repaired. Cell service was non-existent this deep in the forest. If he wanted help, he'd have to drive out. But the nearest town was 18 miles down the mountain trail, and with snow this deep, even his truck might not make it. He'd need to wait until the storm passed and the forest thawed, at least enough to move safely. He looked back at the dog, who now watched him with quiet intensity, head resting on its paws. "Looks like we're stuck with each other a bit longer," Hank said, offering a weak smile. For the first time, the dog's tail thumped once against the floor. By mid-morning, the sky outside had turned a flat, milky gray. Though the wind had eased and the snowflakes fell softer now, the world beyond Hank's cabin remained a frozen, soundless ocean. Trees stood like frozen sentinels, their branches weighed down by layers of white. Inside, the fire cracked and spit gently, casting warmth that crept into the bones of the place. Hank stood at the kitchen counter, slicing a slab of leftover venison jerky into smaller strips. The German shepherd, now awake and slightly more alert, lay on the blanket near the hearth, lifting his head at every movement, ears twitching slightly with interest. The bandaged leg still stretched awkwardly to one side, but the dog no longer trembled as it had the night before. That in itself felt like progress. "You've got an appetite, don't you?" Hank muttered, placing the strips onto a ceramic plate. He set it down a few feet from the shepherd and stepped back. The dog hesitated only a moment before pulling himself forward and devouring the food in deliberate, hungry bites. Hank watched, arms crossed. His eyes trailed from the dog's mouth to the thick fur around its neck. There, nearly hidden beneath tangles and grit, something glinted. Curiosity stirred. He crouched, waiting for the dog to finish before reaching out slowly, fingers careful. The shepherd didn't flinch, only watched him with those solemn, intelligent eyes. With gentle hands, Hank worked through the fur and found it. A cracked plastic tag attached to a half-torn nylon collar, barely clinging on by a rusted loop. He turned the tag over. The surface was scratched and worn, much of the lettering unreadable, but one thing remained faintly visible in the center of the dirt-caked plastic. NERO-K9RET. Hank's heart paused. Nero, he read aloud. The shepherd's ears flicked up at the sound. K9? Retired? He narrowed his eyes at the initials. It made sense more than he wanted to admit. The way the dog moved, the calm under pressure, the discipline even in pain. Hank had worked with handlers before, back in his early forestry years, helping search and rescue crews during missing hiker alerts. This dog, Nero, wasn't just any stray. He had once worn a badge of his own. Hank sat back on his heels and exhaled slowly, running a hand down his weathered face. The tag explained a lot, and it also complicated everything. He tossed another log onto the fire and dropped into his chair, staring at Nero, who had returned to his resting spot. The dog curled up tightly, tail to nose, but kept one eye open, watching. There was a gravity to him, as though he'd seen too much for his years. Like Hank himself. His mind drifted. 5 winters ago, he and Evelyn had been gathering saplings near the northern ridge when the winds shifted. A lightning strike earlier that week had ignited the underbrush miles away, and no one thought it would reach them. But it did, swift and hungry. By the time they saw the smoke and felt the heat, it was too late. They'd gotten separated in the panic. Hank made it out. Evelyn didn't. The rescue team found her 3 days later, too late to help. Since then, the cabin had become Hank's fortress and his exile. He'd pushed away friends, ignored neighbors, let the roads to his place get overgrown. It had been easier to let the wilderness swallow him than face the sound of his own sorrow. But now, with this wounded dog sleeping beside his fire, something stirred that had long gone dormant. He glanced back at the tag and then to Nero. "Where did you come from?" he asked aloud. "And who left you out there like that?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but his tail thumped once. Later that afternoon, as Hank was sorting through a crate of old flannels and wool blankets in the back room, he heard the scratching sound of claws on wood. When he returned to the main room, he found Nero standing shakily near the door. The injured leg hovered slightly above the floor, but the dog was upright, alert. He turned to Hank and let out a low, quiet huff. "You want out?" Hank asked. Nero wagged his tail once, then twice. Hank opened the door slowly. The cold rushed in again, sharp and biting, but Nero stepped outside, his gait uneven yet determined. He sniffed at the snow, his ears flicking back and forth, reading the air. Hank stood on the porch behind him, boots crunching on the frozen planks. The sky was the color of old steel. The world was hushed. Nero limped a few feet into the snow, then stopped. He looked into the forest, then back at Hank, as if gauging something unseen. "You looking for someone?" Hank asked softly. Nero didn't move. He simply stood there, watching the tree line, muscles taut despite the wound. After a few minutes, he turned and made his way back toward the porch, where Hank helped steady him. They went back inside, and Hank closed the door against the wind. That night, Hank sat with an old leather journal in his lap. The edges were frayed and the pages had long since yellowed. He hadn't written in it since Evelyn died, but tonight he opened it, the pen in his hand feeling clumsy but welcome. He wrote only one line. "Nero came through the storm today. I think he might have saved me more than I saved him." When he looked up, Nero had already curled himself into the blanket again, his breathing slow and steady. The fire cracked once more, and outside, the wind began to rise again, whispering secrets into the trees. The sky over Bitterroot was beginning to shift. The once steely clouds had cracked open into a pale amber light, a rare warmth casting long gold shadows across the snowy ridge. Hank stood on his porch in a thick flannel coat, a hand gripping the railing, watching Nero sniff the edge of the tree line. The dog's gait was still uneven, but determination burned beneath every step. There was something about the way he moved, the way his ears twitched at distant sounds, that told Hank this dog wasn't just wandering, he was searching. Back inside, the firewood stack had begun to dwindle. Hank knew he'd need to take the snowmobile into town soon, not just for supplies, but for answers. Nero's tag had gnawed at his mind for days. Someone, somewhere, had let this dog go, or lost him. He deserved more than a warm cabin and first aid. He deserved to be found. What Hank didn't know was that someone was already looking for him. About 20 miles north, across the Bitterroot Range, a woman in a forest green jacket stood beside a battered pickup at the edge of a snow-choked trailhead. Her name was Elise Hartman, and her boots crunched into the snow with impatient rhythm. She was in her mid-30s, lean and wiry, with dark blonde hair pulled into a low bun under a fleece-lined hood. Her gray eyes were sharp, perpetually scanning, shaped by years spent outdoors in every kind of terrain. Her skin bore the evidence of harsh Montana weather-ruddy cheeks, a faint scar near the left temple from a long-forgotten training mishap. Elise worked as a senior field officer for the Missoula Animal Search and Rescue Unit, a non-profit organization specializing in lost service dogs, wildlife displacement, and post-disaster animal recovery. She'd spent the last week combing through forests and ghost roads on the edge of the Bitterroot Wilderness, following a dwindling GPS beacon last transmitted by a retired K-9 unit named Nero. And Nero was no ordinary dog to her. 2 years ago, Elise had worked a flood rescue with the Missoula Fire Department. Nero, a then-active German shepherd partnered with a handler named Sergeant Mark Vance, had helped pull 3 children from a submerged vehicle in the Blackfoot Valley. Elise had been there when Nero limped ashore, with a child's coat clenched between his teeth. She'd been there again 6 months later, when Mark was killed during a wildfire operation. Nero had tried to stay with the body, refusing food for 3 days. The department eventually retired him, declaring him emotionally unfit for continued service and transferred him to a temporary home. Then came the avalanche 6 weeks ago. The facility where Nero was being held suffered a power outage. He'd disappeared into the storm. No one had seen him since. Until 3 days ago, when Elise picked up a faint GPS ping-an, old collar signal, barely functional, somewhere near the southern edge of the Bitterroot Basin. She had followed it here, to the foot of a mountain no one wanted to climb in winter. Standing in the snow, she checked her map again, tracing the ridgelines with a gloved finger. There were few structures up this way, but one was noted, a cabin once owned by a forestry ranger named Hank Sawyer. The notes didn't say much, only that he'd declined community services and hadn't checked in since autumn. Elise tucked the map away, shouldered her pack, and began the hike. It took nearly 2 hours of trudging through calf-deep snow and navigating frozen deer trails before she caught sight of chimney smoke curling into the open sky. She paused, panting, hand on a tree trunk for balance. Then she saw the cabin sturdy, unpainted, with snow piled along the eaves and a stacked woodpile beside it. More importantly, she saw the figure of a man, tall, bearded, watching her with wary eyes and a dog by his side. Even at a distance, she knew it was Nero. She stepped forward, raising both hands slowly. "Don't mean to startle you," she called out. "I'm Elise Hartman. I think I know that dog." Hank's eyes narrowed. He stepped in front of Nero without thinking, the protective gesture so instinctive it surprised even him. Elise stopped about 20 feet away, breathing hard. "I work with Missoula Animal Rescue. That dog, he's been missing. I've been tracking his signal." Hank's gaze flicked to Nero. The dog had gone still, tail low, ears forward. Then something shifted. Nero stepped past Hank, just a few paces, and tilted his head, as if remembering something from another life. "You said his name was Nero?" Hank asked. Elise nodded. "Retired K-9, disappeared after the storm 6 weeks ago. We didn't think he survived." "He did," Hank said slowly. "Barely." They stood in silence for a beat, the wind rustling the furs around them. Then Hank gestured toward the door. "Come inside. It's warmer in there." Inside, Elise removed her snow-covered jacket, revealing a thermal vest and worn jeans. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to unstable footing and unpredictable animals. Nero followed her with his eyes, but didn't move from the hearth. When she knelt near him, she didn't speak right away. She let him sniff her gloves, then slowly extended a hand. Nero leaned forward and gently bumped her palm with his nose. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Relief, grief, maybe both. "He remembers," she said quietly. "We trained together, just once, after Mark died." Hank sat across from her, pouring hot water into a mug. "He's been through hell. That leg, it was almost septic. I patched him up best I could." "You did better than most would have," Elise said. "Most people wouldn't have opened the door." "Didn't have much of a choice," Hank muttered. He asked with his eyes. She smiled faintly. "That's Nero." As the fire crackled between them, Elise explained the rescue operation, her role in tracking missing dogs, and how rare it was for a K9 to survive so long in the wilderness. She'd planned to stay only an hour, but when Hank offered her coffee and a spare bunk to rest before the hike back, she accepted. She hadn't slept indoors in 2 nights. That evening, Hank found himself listening more than talking. Elise spoke of rescues, of dogs who never came home, of moments where instinct made the difference between life and loss. She didn't ask about Evelyn, but she glanced at the photo once on the shelf and nodded slightly as if she understood. As the moon rose over the ridgeline and the snow settled into silence once more, Nero slept between them, his breathing steady, the firelight casting his silhouette against the logs like a sentinel come home. The cold had returned with sharper teeth. By early morning, the wind was back to scraping across the eaves and threading through the cracks in the log walls. Hank stirred from the shallow sleep that had claimed him sometime after midnight, waking to the distant groan of shifting tree limbs outside. He rubbed his eyes and sat up on the couch, the fire's glow now reduced to a bed of sleepy embers. Across the room, Nero was already awake. The German shepherd stood motionless near the front door, his head tilted slightly and ears pricked toward the forest. His injured leg was still wrapped in fresh gauze, and though he hadn't placed weight on it fully, the restlessness in his stance was undeniable. His breath was steady but quickened, his nose twitching at scents that only he could read. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't calm either. Hank rose and approached quietly, boots creaking against the worn floorboards. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Nero didn't turn. His eyes stayed fixed on something far beyond the wooden threshold. That morning, while Elise remained asleep in the spare bunk, Hank layered up in his old field jacket, scarf, and gloves. The storm had calmed just enough to make a walk outside bearable, and Nero seemed insistent. Hank had no plans to let the dog limp through the forest alone, but perhaps a short loop around the property would ease the tension stirring in them both. Outside, the air was like broken glass in the lungs. The sun hung low behind sheer gray clouds, offering light but no warmth. The snow had settled in deep waves across the clearing, soft and untouched, except for a set of tracks. They weren't from Hank, and they weren't from Nero. Hank stopped in his tracks, staring at the faint indentations leading from the tree line to the corner of his woodpile, then vanishing again into the trees. They were too wide for deer, too deep for a fox or rabbit. He crouched beside them, brushing the top layer of snow away with a gloved hand. Boot prints, human. But only one set. No snowshoes, no dragging sled. The stride was inconsistent, slightly uneven, as if the person had been limping or stumbling. Fresh, too. The snow hadn't yet refrozen in the print's edges. Nero let out a low growl behind him, ears flattened. Hank stood slowly, scanning the surrounding trees. "Someone was here last night," he murmured, watching. They followed the tracks only as far as the first ridge, about 100 yards from the cabin. Beyond that, the trail became erratic, veering in and out of thick brush and descending toward a gully. Hank didn't pursue it, not without knowing who or what was on the other end. Back at the cabin, Elise was awake, seated at the kitchen table and scribbling into a weathered field notebook. Her cheeks were flushed from sleep, and a few strands of hair had escaped her bun, brushing against her temples. She looked up as they entered. "You were out early." Hank nodded and kicked snow from his boots. "Something spooked Nero. Found footprints out by the woodpile. Human, probably, but not local. Nobody should be out here in that kind of cold without gear." Elise's expression changed. She set her pen down, brows tightening. "You think it's someone looking for him?" "Maybe, but it didn't feel right. Whoever it was, they didn't come to the door, just circled and left." Elise stood and walked to the window, peering through the frosted glass. We've had issues before, with people who don't want retired canines going to shelters. Some see them as property or status symbols. She paused. There's a man calls himself Boone Reller. Used to run a training camp for retired dogs down near Polson. Got shut down for cruelty. Banned from operating within state limits, but people like him don't go quietly. Hank exhaled. You think he might be trying to get Nero back? I don't know. I've been tracking Nero, not Boone. But if he knew Nero was out here, and he made it up this far... She trailed off, jaw clenched. The idea that someone had stood outside his cabin, watching, made Hank's gut twist. It wasn't just about a dog anymore. They agreed to keep the doors locked and take turns watching the perimeter. Elise, ever practical, unpacked a pair of motion sensors from her rucksack's small black cylinders that blinked faint red when activated. She installed one at the edge of the trail and another near the shed, careful to bury them beneath branches and snow. That night, the three of them stayed in the main room. Elise and Hank sipped tea in silence, both listening to the wind and the occasional soft, alert chirp from the motion sensors. Nero lay between them, his head resting on his good paw, but his eyes never closed for long. Hank, in a moment of reflection, glanced over at Elise. You've done this a lot, huh? Find animals, take them back, keep them safe. She nodded. Yeah. Most of them don't come back like this, though. Nero's different. He's more than a dog, Hank said softly. He always has been. A pause. Why'd you start doing this? He asked. She looked at him, quiet for a moment. Then she said, My brother was a handler, Marine Corps. His partner saved his life during a patrol in Kandahar. But after they came home, the dog was separated from him. Different units, paperwork, you know how it goes. My brother spent months fighting the system to get her back, but she was sent to another base. He never got to see her again. Her voice was even, but her hands trembled slightly as she cradled her mug. He died in an accident a year later. I guess I kept doing this because I couldn't save them both. But I could save others. Hank didn't know what to say, so he didn't. Instead, he reached for a fresh log and stoked the fire, letting the warmth speak where words failed. As the clock edged toward midnight, one of the sensors outside gave a single sharp beep. Elise was on her feet first. Hank grabbed the old hunting flashlight from the mantel. Nero rose too, body tense, gaze locked on the door. They moved quietly, Hank at the front, Elise covering the back window. Snow danced outside like ash. But there was no figure, no movement, just a faint set of tracks. New ones leading away from the back of the cabin into the woods. They didn't follow, not yet. Whoever it was, they were out there, watching, waiting. But what they didn't know was that Hank wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Nero. The snow came without warning, thick wind-driven sheets that erased the line between earth and sky. By noon, the ridges behind Hank's cabin had vanished into a white blur, and the trees bowed under the accumulating weight. The old wood stove creaked with effort, filling the space with a dry, smoky warmth that clung to their clothes and settled in the cabin's beams like a familiar scent. Hank sat by the window, watching the storm suffocate the trail he and Elise had cleared the day before. A shovel leaned uselessly against the porch rail. Even if they'd planned to leave today, nature had other intentions. Behind him, Nero lay curled tightly on the rug near the hearth, his breathing shallow but steady. The warmth of the fire had done little to cool the heat rising under his fur. His nose was hot to the touch, and his eyes, once sharply observant, had grown glassy. He's running a fever, Elise said quietly, crouched beside the dog. She placed a hand on his side, feeling the rise and fall of his ribs. It's not just the leg anymore. Infection's spreading. Hank turned. How bad? Too bad to wait a week. She looked up at him. Her voice was calm, but the strain around her eyes betrayed a deeper urgency. If we can't get him to a vet within 48 hours, he could go septic. We're past the point where bandages will help. Hank ran a hand through his beard. The pass is blocked. Even if the roads were clear, we're 4 miles from the nearest trailhead. We'll have to stabilize him until the storm clears, Elise replied. She stood, brushing her palms on her jeans. Fluids, heat, and if you have any kind of antibiotics, even outdated ones, they might buy us some time. Hank crossed to a cabinet near the kitchen. After digging through a metal first aid tin and a set of old gearboxes from his forestry days, he returned with a battered orange prescription bottle. "Tetracycline," he said, offering it to her. "Expired last year, but it's all I've got." Elise read the faded label, then nodded. "It'll have to do." They worked in silence after that. Hank heated water and poured it into old canteens, wrapping them in towels and setting them near Nero's body to keep his temperature regulated. Elise crushed the antibiotic tablets and stirred the powder into a bit of soft venison, coaxing the dog to eat. At first Nero refused, turning his head away with a low groan. But eventually he accepted the food, chewing slowly as Elise whispered encouragement. "You remember me, don't you?" she murmured, stroking behind his ears. "I'm not just a face from the past." The dog's eyes fluttered. Then, weakly, his tongue brushed against her wrist, just once, but enough. Later, when the light dimmed into stormy twilight, the three of them gathered close to the fire. Elise had set up a makeshift bedroll nearby, unwilling to stray far from Nero. She sat cross-legged, flipping through a small, rain-stained notebook filled with field notes and sketches. A half-finished drawing of Nero's face appeared on the last page, a memory rendered in sharp pencil lines and soft shading. "You're an artist, too?" Hank asked from his chair, mug of coffee warming his hands. Elise gave a modest shrug. "Not really. Drawing helps me remember details, colors, expressions. It's a habit from training." He studied her from across the room. In the firelight, Elise looked younger somehow, the hardness in her features softened by the flicker of warmth. Her posture remained alert, spine straight, boots still on. But there was a weariness to her that didn't come from the cold. Hank saw it in the way her fingers never quite rested, always touching something her cup, the notebook, Nero's collar. "You ever think of quitting?" he asked. "Every week," she said with a short laugh. "But then I think of the ones we don't find, and I stay." Hank nodded. "You remind me of my wife." Elise looked over, surprised. "She was a firefighter," Hank continued. "Up in the Swan Valley, first in, last out. That kind of woman." He smiled faintly, eyes distant. "Never stopped until she found every last person." Elise's gaze softened. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." She was someone everyone liked, but she ran into a wildfire too late. We got separated. He cleared his throat. "I haven't had many visitors since." Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the window panes. Elise stood and crossed to the window, wiping a circle in the frost to peer out. "Still no visibility." "We'll be lucky if it clears by tomorrow," Hank muttered. Elise turned back, her voice suddenly more businesslike. "We need to rotate shifts tonight. Someone has to watch his breathing." "I'll take the first watch," Hank said immediately. She nodded. "Wake me if he worsens." As she settled into the corner bunk with her pack under her head and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, Hank shifted closer to Nero. The dog stirred slightly, letting out a low, muffled groan. Hank placed a steady hand on his back. "You hang in there, big guy," he murmured. "We've come too far." For a while, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic wind beyond the walls. Hank remained at Nero's side, watching the pulse rise and fall beneath his fur, counting each breath like a clock ticking in reverse. Around midnight, Nero stirred more violently. His legs twitched, tail beating weakly against the floor. He let out a sharp whine, eyes darting beneath their lids. Hank leaned closer. "Hey, easy there." Nero woke with a sharp inhale and tried to sit, but collapsed again, panting. Elise was instantly awake, crossing the room in 2 quick strides. She knelt and pressed her hands to Nero's chest. "His fever's up. We need to cool him." Using towels soaked in snowmelt, they pressed cool cloths to his ears and paws, massaging the limbs gently. Hank fetched more ice water, while Elise whispered soothing phrases, her breath visible in the chilled air. Nero's breathing remained shallow, but after 20 tense minutes, the color began to return to his gums and his ears lost their burning heat. He was still in danger, but stable. By morning, the storm had begun to break. Sunlight filtered weakly through thinning clouds, touching the snow-laden landscape in gold. Elise stood at the porch, radio in hand, trying to catch a signal. Hank remained inside, feeding logs to the fire. Nero slept now, chest rising and falling with greater ease. They had made it through the night. The wind had calmed to a whisper by late afternoon, leaving behind a landscape that looked carved from ice and silence. Snow lay deep in every direction, unbroken and gleaming beneath the pale sun. From inside the cabin, it almost seemed like the storm had never happened, except for the fatigue etched into the faces of those within. Nero was asleep again, breathing easier now, though he remained too weak to move far. Hank sat at the table with a pair of binoculars, scanning the tree line through a patch of cleaned window. Elise crouched near the fireplace, replenishing the hot water packs around Nero's body, her every motion slow, deliberate. Just as the light began to dim again, casting long shadows across the white plain outside, Nero stirred. His ears twitched and his head lifted. Hank noticed it immediately. "You hear something?" he asked. Nero didn't respond, just stared toward the window, eyes fixed and ears fully erect. Then, as the final strands of sunlight slipped behind the ridge, the dog's posture changed. He drew in a long breath, tilted his head back, and released a single, piercing howl. The sound rose high and mournful, vibrating through the wood walls and the hearts of the two humans beside him. It was not a howl of pain. It was a call, ancient and undeniable, sent into the forest as if to summon a memory buried in snow. Hank and Elise exchanged a glance. "He's not just calling," Elise said, already rising. "He's answering." They bundled up Fast Hank in his canvas coat and old trapper's hat, Elise throwing on her green field jacket and grabbing a flashlight. Nero tried to rise, but Hank placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stay, boy, we'll go." The wind picked up again as they stepped outside, brushing snow from the porch railing and scanning the nearby slope. The trees were still, and the powder lay untouched until Hank caught it. "There," he pointed, movement down past the gully. Elise raised her binoculars and focused. "Something's limping. It's not a coyote." Without another word, they moved down the slope, their boots crunching through the top layer of snow. Hank carried a wool blanket under one arm, just in case. The sun had dropped low enough to leave the forest in near dusk. The only sound was their breath and the occasional creak of ice-laden branches overhead. Then they saw it. Half collapsed at the edge of a narrow gully was a German shepherd, smaller than Nero, and much younger. Its coat was patchy and dull, black and tan, but dulled with dirt and ice. The animal was shaking, one front paw raised and tucked to its chest. Its eyes flicked up at them as they approached, wide, cautious, afraid. "Easy, buddy," Elise whispered, crouching down and extending her hand. "We're here to help." The young shepherd didn't run, though it flinched as Hank laid the blanket over its back. It let out a low whimper, not hostile, just spent. Elise gently reached under its chest and lifted, surprised at how little weight there was to carry. "It's a pup," she said, voice tight with emotion. "Barely past a year." They carried the dog up the slope together, pausing only once when Elise nearly slipped. Inside the cabin, Nero struggled to lift his head, and when he saw them enter with the younger shepherd in their arms, he gave a low bark, weak but filled with recognition. Elise laid the new arrival near the fire, brushing snow from its fur. The young shepherd let out a shaky sigh and closed its eyes. Nero shifted, dragging himself forward despite Hank's protests, until he was close enough to nuzzle the newcomer gently with his nose. "It's him," Elise said softly. "It's Ranger." "Ranger?" Hank repeated. Elise nodded. He was assigned to Nero in the early stages of field training. Nero was his mentor. They were separated when the kennel collapsed during the storm last month. We assumed Ranger hadn't made it. The two dogs lay side by side now, their bodies curved toward one another in an unconscious echo of bond and protection. Ranger shifted slightly, letting his muzzle rest across Nero's paws. Nero's tail thumped once against the floor, and he let out a quiet huff, as if reassuring him, "I'm still here." Hank stood in silence, watching the scene with a tightness in his chest that surprised him. Later that evening, Elise brewed a fresh pot of coffee while Hank cleaned and wrapped Ranger's injured paw. There were small cuts on the pads and clear signs of frostbite, but nothing life-threatening. The dog had simply run out of strength. "I don't understand how he found his way here," Hank said, dabbing antiseptic onto the raw skin. "Bond," Elise said quietly. "Some dogs follow scent. Others, especially dogs like these, follow memory. Ranger must have kept moving until he caught even the faintest trace of Nero." "They're like soldiers," Hank murmured. "They are soldiers," she replied. That night, the fire burned hot and bright. Elise fell asleep early, curled in her coat near the hearth. Hank stayed awake longer, the journal open again on his lap. He stared at the blank page for a long while before writing. 2 soldiers reunited tonight. Ranger found his way through the storm. I think the worst may finally be behind us. Nero and Ranger lay asleep together, breathing in sync, their fur rising and falling in a rhythm older than language. The storm outside had calmed. The world, for now, was quiet. Morning arrived like a whispered promise, soft and pale through the pines. The snow had stopped during the night, and the wind that once howled through the mountains was now no more than a hush in the trees. The sky was washed with watercolor streaks of lavender and rose, and the world outside Hank's cabin looked untouched, still, like it had been holding its breath for something to begin. Inside, Nero and Ranger were asleep side by side near the fireplace, their fur glowing with the flickering light. Elise was already up, pacing lightly in the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. Hank, leaning by the window, looked over his shoulder as she let out a soft laugh. Relief more than amusement. "They cleared the road to Missoula," she said. "The plows made it through the North Pass early this morning." "That's good," Hank said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. She crossed the room, her boots thudding lightly against the floor. Elise had tied her coppery hair back into a messy braid, and despite the circles under her eyes, there was a gentle light in her expression. "We can get them the care they need now." Hank nodded and looked at Nero, who opened one eye as if sensing the shift in energy. The big dog slowly pushed himself to a sitting position, then nudged Ranger awake with his nose. Ranger yawned, his ears perked, but his body still weak. They didn't leave until just after noon. Hank packed his old truck with blankets, fresh water, and the few medical supplies Elise had brought. The dogs were lifted gently into the back seat, Ranger nestled into Nero's side like a child refusing to be apart from an older brother. The road out was narrower than usual, with towering walls of plowed snow rising on either side. Trees drooped under the weight of ice. As Hank drove, Elise updated her team at the Missoula Rescue Center. Her voice was calm and assured, but every few minutes she would glance at the back seat and smile faintly at the sight of the dogs resting together. The journey took nearly 4 hours. Hank had rarely driven into Missoula in recent years, not since the accident. The town had changed in little ways, new signage here, fresh paint there, but the familiar roads tugged at him with quiet nostalgia. By the time they pulled into the gravel lot of the Missoula Animal Rescue Center, his knuckles were white around the steering wheel. The center was a modest building, 2 stories, pale yellow siding, and an attached fenced courtyard lined with pine trees. A tall woman in scrubs stood outside waiting. She was in her late 40s, with short silver-streaked hair and warm, assertive eyes. This was Dr. Linda Mathis, the center's head veterinarian. She greeted Elise with a firm hug. Dr. Mathis knelt beside the truck and looked at the dogs. "You weren't kidding," she said, her tone gentle but professional. "They look like they've been through a war." "They have," Hank said from behind her, his voice low. Dr. Mathis turned, studying him. "You're Hank?" He nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. Inside, the center buzzed with quiet efficiency. Hank followed them through the wide, heated hallways as Nero and Ranger were gently carried into the treatment room. Nero didn't resist the exam. When Dr. Mathis touched the scar along his flank, he merely blinked, his eyes calm. Ranger, on the other hand, let out a soft whine but didn't pull away. He, too, had learned trust again. As the dogs were tended to, Hank wandered outside to the back courtyard. There, surrounded by chain-link fences and snow-covered trees, he stood alone for a long moment. His breath made clouds in the air. In the silence, he thought of Lila, his wife, gone for so long now. He remembered how she used to crouch beside injured birds or leave scraps for stray cats. "Every living thing deserves a second chance," she used to say. "Hey." Elise's voice broke the quiet. She walked up beside him, stuffing her hands into her coat pockets. "They'll be okay. Nero needs a couple more days on antibiotics, Ranger too, but they're going to make it." "I know," Hank said. Then, after a pause, "Thank you for coming out there, for looking for him." Elise smiled. "I didn't do it alone." There was a bench nearby, and they sat. A squirrel darted across the snow, leaving tiny tracks behind. Elise watched it for a moment. "We could use someone like you know," she said. At the center, Hank gave a short, dry chuckle. "I'm not a vet. You don't have to be. We've got volunteers who help with walking, cleaning, even just sitting with the animals who aren't ready for people yet. Sometimes all they need is someone to be quiet with them." He looked at her then, at the sincerity in her expression. There was no pressure, just invitation. He turned back toward the building, where through the window he could see Nero's head resting on a padded blanket, eyes open and watchful. 2 weeks later, Hank walked through the front door of the rescue center again, this time with no storm at his back. Ranger had gained weight. Nero's fur had grown glossier. They both trotted toward him when he entered the courtyard, tails wagging, ears alert. He knelt, letting them swarm around him. Nero licked his cheek once and then sat down, proud and tall. Ranger leaned against his knee. Elise appeared nearby, holding a clipboard, but not interrupting. "You came back," she said. Hank stood, brushing snow from his coat. "Told you I might." "We've got a few new arrivals who don't like anyone yet," she said, lifting an eyebrow. "Might need someone who knows how to wait quietly." "I can do quiet," Hank said, and smiled. That day, Hank signed up as an official volunteer. He started coming every week. Sometimes he helped with repairs to the old fencing. Sometimes he sat in the kennels, whispering stories to dogs too afraid to come near. And sometimes he just watched Nero and Ranger sleeping in the sun, breathing in tandem like they had never been apart. And so, the man who once closed his world after loss found it opening again because of a knock at the door, a wounded shepherd, and the silent courage of one winter night. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with noise or signs. They come quietly on 4 tired legs through a snowstorm to the heart that's ready to open. In everyday life, too, God sends us second chances. Through people, through animals, through love we didn't expect. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and may God bless you and your family. Type Amen if you believe in the quiet miracles around us.